Hi, this is QAShahin, and today we're going to look at Find Element. We're going to look at what Find Element is and how finding an element relates to WebDriverJS, and also why it is important that you understand this fundamental concept in order to be able to use WebDriverJS properly. So the agenda of this video is actually very simple. We're first going to look at what an element is, and how you would write code to find an element on a web page, and then we're going to see what you can do to interact with that element. So the first thing we need to do is navigate to the testroom.com. So this is my blog site. This is where I upload blog posts on topics which I usually don't cover as part of my YouTube videos, such as concepts around manual testing, concepts around agile, and so on. So if you haven't already subscribed to my blog, please do so, just to keep up to date with some topics that I, as said, don't really cover on YouTube. Anyway, once you navigate to the testroom.com, scroll down and you will see this link here that says Test Web App. Click on this link, and this will take you to a site that I've built to help people use this as training wheels to write test code for applications such as WebDriverJS. So this is a site that I use to help explain fundamental things such as elements, such as page navigation, such as interacting with a browser using technologies such as WebDriver. So back to the topic. The first thing we need to identify is an element. So what is an element? An element is something that is represented on a web page, for instance. So we have large text, we have small text. There's a good chance this might be a heading text and this might be a paragraph text. We have other things such as links, which you can identify because of the mouse cursor changing to an icon that represents a link. We have links that open up additional windows. When you say click on this contact link, that takes you to another page. On the contact page, we have forms such as input fields. We have other forms of interactive buttons such as checkboxes, such as radio buttons. We have sliders, and so on. In simple terms, anything on a web page that appears, say, inside a box as text, as images, so on, these are all elements. So anything you see on a web page is essentially an element. An element is something that you can interact with on a web page. For instance, it is entirely possible to write code to put in text into, say, this field. It is entirely possible to select this radio button. It's entirely possible to move this slider, and it is entirely possible to hit this button here. So now that we have a really simple understanding of what an element is, let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So to look at this in a little bit more detail, what we're going to do is right click on something. So let's just say right click on this contact link and select Inspect Element. So when you select to inspect on an element, what that does is that allows you to see the HTML code of that element. So in this case, this contact link here is represented in this line of text here. So this is a HTML tag that is representing this contact link. When we talk about element, this is literally what we're talking about. An element is a HTML tag that is represented as a visual thing on a web page. So in this case, we have an A tag, which in the HTML world is known as an anchor tag. So this anchor tag is this contact link. So when I click on this contact link, essentially what I'm doing is clicking on this anchor tag. Now, what does WebDriver do? So we've established the fact that this is an element. When we use WebDriver to interact with a page, WebDriver, although it looks like it's actually interacting with a web page, what it is actually doing is finding information in the page source. So to see the page source, you right click and say View Page Source. all this is a collection of all the tags which are represented on this page. So let's just say we want to click on this link. WebDriver will try and find this particular anchor tag and then do something with it. So the first thing we want to do is somehow identify this through some means and then do something with it. So now that we've established that this is an example of an element and this is what is represented on the HTML page as that element, let's take this information forward and actually do something with it. So this was our previous code that we wrote. So the first thing we're going to do is really quickly go to this URL, and instead of going to the testroom.com, we're just going to go to testroom.com/webapp. Now let's save this and run this just to make sure it's still running. Okay, so it looks like he opened up the browser and closed it, which is good because he actually navigated to this site. So what we now need to do is somehow identify this. So if we go back to the code, WebDriver has this method called a by method, and this by method allows us to identify things on a page. But before we talk about the by method, we need to talk about the find element method. So going back to our very first slide where we said we're going to use find element. Find element is a method inside WebDriver. So to get this method, we say driver.find element. Now it is this find element that allows us to actually find an element on a web page. Now to find an element, we need to use another method provided by WebDriver called by. Now this by method takes in a lot of options. In other words, this by method has access to a lot of methods which allow us to select something on a web page. So we're going to look at one example. If we go back to this contact link, we can see the makeup of this contact link. So this contact link is inside an anchor tag, which has an ID attribute with a value. It has a href attribute with a value. It has a name attribute with a value, and the actual value of the anchor tag is contact. So there's a lot of information here that we can use. For the moment, we're going to try and use the ID attribute to try and find this element. Now, like I said, the by method has options to find an element based on something. And in this case, we're going to use the ID attribute. Now, the ID attribute, as we saw, has a value of contact underscore link. So we're going to say contact underscore link. Now, what is happening here? So here what we're saying is driver.find element. So this is going to find an element, and then it's going to try and find an element by an ID where the value of the ID is contact underscore link. Now once we find this element, what we want to do is interact with it. Now there are a number of codes that we can write to interact with it, but the most common one is probably click. Now what is happening here? So right now what we've done is written a simple line of code where we're saying driver find element. So this will find an element, and then find the element by ID where the value of the ID is contact underscore link. And once we've found an element, click on it. Now to use this by method, we need to import in another WebDriver class called by. Now to do this, we're just going to say var by, which is equal to WebDriver dot by, and that's it. So now let's save it and run it. So what should happen now is a web browser should open up, and we should then click on that contact link. Great. It looks like although the web page was very quickly loaded and very quickly it jumped from the home page to the contact page, we were able to click on that contact button. So what have we covered in this video? So in this video, we looked at what an element is, we looked at how to write a simple line of code for that element, and then we looked at a very simple example of clicking on that element. In the next video, we're going to explore this idea of element a little bit further, and we're going to try and understand how to use other methods to interact with other information provided for that same contact link. Thanks a lot for watching. I will see you in the next one.